¿Me puedes oír? Alza la mano si me puedes oír. Alza la mano si me puedes oír. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Raise your hand if you can hear me. Alza la mano si me puedes oír. Me siento súper maestra haciendo esto. Bueno, dos anuncios. Perdimos una mochila negra. A ver, ¿está por ahí Tomás? ¿Tomás? ¿No? Bueno, ahorita que venga Tomás le preguntamos más detalles de su mochila. Ok. Muy importante, esta sesión va a ser en inglés. Hay varios traductores, equipos de traducción. Mira, me encanta. Ya hay fila en el equipo de traducción. Me encanta. Esta sesión sería en inglés. Les recomendamos, si quieren pasar por su equipo de traducción, nos están comentando que los traductores están haciendo una labor espectacular. Un aplauso para los traductores. Un aplauso para la agencia Guío de logística que nos ha ayudado en todo. Un aplauso para todo el staff Laris. El maestro Reggie nos va a regañar por tantos aplausos. Un aplauso por el tejido del mapeo del consorcio NAR. Pablo. Laris es la segunda parte de un mapeo que llevábamos desde 2022 co-creando para encontrar dónde están los agronegocios regenerativos de Latinoamérica. Y quiero dar un agradecimiento a una persona que no está aquí. Pásenle. Un agradecimiento a Caro Robino, de IDRC, que inició nuestra colaboración del consorcio NAR. Vamos a seguir agradeciéndole a ella cada día, pero gracias a Caro Robino. El que no la conoce, se está perdiendo una tejedora regenerativa. Bueno, ya estoy aquí calmando las aguas. Muy bien. ¿Todos tienen su traductor? Los que no tengan traductor, you can go get your translation device over there. Is everyone ready? Where's our star? The star of the show? ¿Dónde está John? Ok. Ahí viene. Bueno, nada más queríamos hacer un anuncio. Tomás de Lara anda por ahí, perdió su mochila negra. Si alguien la tomó sin querer, porque hay muchas mochilas negras, creo que nos va a compartir un poco más de los detalles de su mochila para poderla distinguir, porque hay muchas mochilas negras, pero bueno. ¿Tú sabes? Ok. No hay detalles, es mochila negra. Está muy difícil eso. Bueno. Y en 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. ¡Woo! Estoy muy emocionada. Aquí tenemos un gran maestro. John ha sido el causante, the provocator of my regenerative intentions. So thank you, John. Thank you for being here. It took a while to convince John, but we have amazing friends from Global Affairs Canada, from Alinea that helped us, and Capital Institute that has been amazing partner. So thank you, John, for being here, and thank you for your friendship, and thank you for teaching us and sharing.
Thank you, Laura. The reason I am here is because of you, Laura. I wouldn't miss the big unveiling. So it's a pleasure to be here. I don't know how much you all are hearing about what's going on in the good old United States. So the first thing I have to say is thank you for letting me across the border. The second thing I have to say is I'm deeply sorry about what's happening in our country. And I'm pretty sure you're not hearing the full story. In fact, from a conversation I just had, I think you're probably only hearing the surface of it. It is terrifying. It is life-changing. It is. It may pass and get back to normal, but it may not. And the best way I can process this is that I've been saying for years, and many of us in this system change business, if you will, have been saying for years, that there's no way the system's going to change unless the pressure builds and there's some kind of a rupture. And of course, that's easy to say in theoretical terms when the sun is shining, but you know, I feel like finally we're feeling that rupture, and it is unknowable how we're going to get through that and what will emerge at the end of that. And the way I keep my sanity is that the process of metamorphosis is uncomfortable, at the very least. And I believe that humanity is going through a metamorphosis in the literal sense of the word. And we don't yet know what the butterfly looks like. And so we've been thinking we could sort of hang out as fat caterpillars and maybe eat a little less. But in reality, we're either going to die as fat caterpillars or we're going to transform into something we don't have any idea what it might be. And I don't mean that like in our physical bodies. I mean in the way we engage as part of this living planet and as part of this living universe. And I truly believe it begins, the root cause of this is exactly what Melina shared this morning, which is this notion of a myth of separation. I've been thinking about this, what we now call polycrisis. In fact, we're going to have to come up with a new word because it was a polycrisis in December, and it's something different now, profoundly different. Not because of what's happening in the United States, because the United States is just one country, but because what happens in the United States and the US economy affects everything. And by the way, that's the science. One of the reasons why I'm so confident that the myth of separation is, if I had to pick one root cause, it's that. It's because our latest science, the 2022 Nobel in Physics was awarded for this idea of non-local, by the way, I forgot how high the elevation is here. So I didn't drink enough water yesterday, and I had insomnia last night. I literally slept not 1 minute. So forgive me when my brain turns off. Hopefully it'll turn back on, but it just had the first brain turn off, because I actually know the word, I just can't recall it. Entanglement. Entanglement, somehow the physicists have proved years ago, but it's now accepted science, Nobel Prize accepted science. The simple non-physics way to understand it, which is the only way I could, is that everything literally is connected to everything, from the microscopic that you can't see all the way up to the scale of the entire universe. So just process that for a minute. What that means is that the conversation we're having today, this entire conference, in some way will affect the future of not just humanity, but life on this planet and the future of the universe. It's a big deal. And that's not my opinion. That's what the science tells us is true. And those of you who know a lot about indigenous wisdom will observe that that's actually, somehow, that was intuited by our indigenous elders. And there's this idea of a unitive narrative, where our latest science is, in a sense, expanding, making more sophisticated, more clear, but essentially endorsing and affirming the intuitive wisdom that many indigenous cultures have had since the beginning of humanity. And that is like such a big, big idea that you can't get your head around that without taking a month off and just meditating on it for a while. And I truly believe that we're living in this moment where that realization is happening. So, with that as an introduction, I had a little difficulty figuring out what I would share today versus what I'm going to share on Friday. And so what I decided to do is come up with a little bit of a tasting menu for you all. Let me see if this works. So here's my tasting menu. I'm prepared to talk about all of this, but we don't have time to really talk about all of this. Actually, where's Laura? How much time do we have? 15 or 50? 1 hour and 15 minutes. Okay. Unless you want to sleep here. That's a bad idea. What I'm proposing today is to share with you, you're going to think this guy's nuts. The world's on fire. He just said everything's, we're turning into a butterfly, but we don't know what the butterfly looks like, and he wants to talk about theory. And here's why. Einstein said theory determines what we're able to see. And I think we are trapped in a worldview that is more grounded in our mechanistic mindset of the scientific revolution, and economics is built on the Newtonian foundation of the mechanistic scientific revolution. And so all of our attempts to think about how to solve these problems are in a sense fatally flawed because we're looking through the wrong lens. So I'd like to spend some time on that real quickly, and then share with you and I don't even think it's visionary, to me it's common sense. And I'll explain what I mean by that. It's not some new vision, it's simply common sense based on what we understand. And then I'd like to talk about this idea I call the finance algorithm, since we're here to talk about investment and finance. The punchline on that is that if you think again back to bodies, biology, we are trapped in a body that is degrading and can't continue, but something's keeping it stuck in place. And that's what an immune system does for a body. It keeps its form in its current shape. The trouble is, in a healthy body, the immune system keeps the bad stuff out and keeps the healthy body healthy. But in our case, we have an unhealthy system, and the immune system is keeping it locked in place. And that immune system is what I call the finance algorithm. And this has nothing to do with whether bankers are good people or bad people. This has nothing to do with liberalism or liberal versus conservative ideology. This is the algorithm that operates the system. So I'd love to talk about that. And then I'd like to apply this regenerative paradigm very briefly to organizations. Since we invest in organizations, we don't invest in the system. We could also have a little riff on tariffs, if anyone happens to be interested in tariffs these days. And I've got a case study. I won't do more than one, but I do have one case study that is not about agriculture, but will help us see the regenerative paradigm. And then some people sometimes are interested in how the hell I got to be doing this when I used to be a happy little banker. So at any rate, I can go in that order until we run out of time, but if there's any one of those that you're not interested in, please shout, because we should eliminate stuff and prioritize stuff. Tariffs, it sounds like we don't need to talk about tariffs. Okay, scratch the tariffs. Well, let's get started, and we'll see how far we go. Why the economy? I'm fascinated. I run a course now, an 8-week course online, and I'm fascinated how many very intelligent, sophisticated people haven't really thought about what is the economy. And the simple way to think about it is it's everything, more than it should be, because even places of worship and yoga practices are embedded in the economy, much less everything we would more naturally think about is embedded in the economy. Kenneth Boulding was one of the early system scientists. How many people have seen this quote? This has been around since the 70s. It was true then, still true. So here's the analogy I'd like to paint. The Ptolemaic worldview that Aristotle believed in, the idea that the Earth is the center of the universe. All you need to do is look up and see the planets rotating around. All you need to do is see the sun rise in the east and set in the west, and it's obvious. The Earth is the center of the universe. Turns out there were scientists trying to figure out why when the planets went around, they would reverse course for a little bit, and then they'd keep going, which made no sense if they were rotating around the Earth. And literally for 1,000 years developed a bunch of theories to explain what I call the wobbles. So they patched the underlying theory with explanations without questioning the underlying assumption. Hold that thought. Fast forward to this guy called Copernicus. He posited that, wait a second, no, and he had reasons to believe this that don't even matter. He said, no, actually, the Earth is in the center of the universe. The sun is, the Earth and all these other planets are rotating on the sun. That explains the wobbles and a lot of other things. And he was afraid to publish that paper until basically his deathbed. And then it was 100 years later that Galileo essentially proved that with his telescope. And the powers that be at the time literally refused to look through Galileo's telescope to see for themselves what he had told them. All they need to do is look through the telescope, and they could have seen it. But what did they do instead? They put him in house arrest for the rest of his life and told him, don't talk about this. And the economics profession has essentially done the same thing to the economists who have dared to question neoclassical economics. They haven't been put in house arrest, but one of my heroes and teachers, Herman Daly, who developed what's called ecological economics, taught his entire, he was a World Bank economist. He's the one that essentially said the economy is embedded in the biosphere, not apart from the biosphere, getting back to the myth of separation on steroids. He taught economics, ecological economics, developed the field with colleagues, and he was never allowed in the economics department at the University of Maryland where he taught. I think he taught out of the geography department. That's a true story for many ecological economists. Oh, so getting back to Newton. Oops. So why do I start with Newton? Newton was obviously the genius that followed the beginning of the scientific revolution and developed what we call Newtonian physics or classical physics. Brilliant man, brilliant mind. He essentially reduced to mathematics the laws of gravity, the laws of motion. It's hard to imagine the world before and after Newton if you lived at that time. It was, suddenly we could figure stuff out. We didn't need to go to the church and be told what truth is. Very threatening to the truth. Boy, I got to master this thing. We're going to be here till midnight. The economics profession was born, as we know it today, was born in the West, born in the afterglow of Newton. Actually, John Locke was probably the first, but we associate the beginning of what we call classical economics with this guy, Adam Smith. An interesting note, it's called classical economics. That's not a coincidence. It's classical physics. Newton's a big deal. We need some classical economics. My theory is all these political philosophers had big egos and wanted to be put on a pedestal comparable to Newton. I haven't found that in the research. But Smith's big idea was this idea of the invisible hand. How many people know about the invisible hand? The idea that our selfish acts somehow magically cause the marketplace to solve our supply-demand problems. And his ideas were born out of this Newtonian, what's called the clockwork universe, the assumption that the universe works as a machine, and that if we can understand how the machine works, we can understand how to manipulate the machine, and when there's a problem, we can fix the problem just like we can fix a machine. And he set about to create economic laws analogous to Newton's laws. And there's several more chapters in this story that I won't share today, but in case you're wondering whether I'm deadly serious, this man, Irving Fisher, the greatest economist the United States has ever produced, according to Milton Friedman. Milton Friedman of University of Chicago fame, neoliberal economics ideology fame. I browsed through Irving Fisher's textbook online and stumbled onto this page. Most of the textbook was math, so I couldn't understand it. But here you see very clearly the assumption that mechanics refers to Newtonian physics. In mechanics, a particle corresponds to the individual in economics. So they literally took the same formulas and did the same math with the assumption that we're all just particles bouncing around in this machine. And that work was disutility, meaning that we would only work in order to get money in order to maximize our utility. So we were these utility maximizing particles disconnected from each other, because that's what Newtonian physics understood, and not part of some greater organism called human civilization. And it turns out that that foundation, that neoclassical foundation, is still what is taught today in most sophisticated universities on this planet. And there are some variations, and it's getting better, but that is the ground go-to modern economics. And that is what led directly to this guy, William Nordhaus, a neoclassical economist, taught by all of these people. By the way, I didn't finish the analogy. We've spent certainly 100 years, more than that, trying to patch the problems with neoclassical economics. The biggest patch being this thing that happened which started in 1929, the stock market crash that led to the Great Depression. The assumption is that the economy would stay in equilibrium, because a machine stays in equilibrium. But it didn't. It crashed. So along comes a guy named John Maynard Keynes, and he says, patch. We can have the government spend to solve the demand gap. Problem solved. We have Keynesian economics. It's a patch to neoclassical economics. It's a branch of neoclassical economics. And we continue on our merry way. And that was done. There's been, 12 Nobel Prizes, fake Nobel Prizes in economics, awarded for other patches. But no one, astonishingly as it is, has gone back to say, wait a second, this whole thing is built on Newtonian physics. And even physics understands that Newtonian physics only explains a small bit of reality. It was never updated for quantum physics, much less updated for the idea that maybe the human economy isn't just a machine, because it's made up of human beings, which aren't really machines, are they? And there's this field called biology that maybe we should knock on that door. And then there's a field called ecology, which is systems, not just individual organisms. The economy is a system. Should we knock on that door? Never happened. Basically has never happened till this day, except for a few of us freaks. So, environmental economics, this is a true story. In 2018, William Nordhaus was awarded the Nobel Prize in Economics, which, as I said, is not a genuine Nobel Prize, story for another day, for his work on what's called environmental economics. And the idea of environmental economics, not to be confused with ecological economics, is to put a price on the externalities, to patch the system, to bring those externalities back into the economy. So we've got a flawed model, and we're now patching it by bringing something called climate change as an externality back into the model, rather than questioning the model. Nobel Prize. Barely a stir. New York Times had an article that essentially congratulated him. It's incredible to me, because his model said we shouldn't shoot for anything lower than 3.5 degrees Celsius warming, because anything lower would cost too much. That's what he said. It's in the paper. And not only that, it's not that big a deal, because the sectors that climate change will affect are pretty small, like agriculture. Whereas manufacturing, which is where the value add is, happens indoors. It's in the paper. That's the state of neoclassical economics. I talked about Herman Daly. He's the first one to essentially say that the economy needs to be understood as a wholly owned subsidiary of the biosphere. But even Herman's work is rooted in what I'll call the materialist paradigm. Okay? If it's true, we need to be able to measure it, we need to be able to quantify it, we need to be able to put it into our model, we need to be able to develop KPIs, we need to be able to develop goals to fix what the problem is. And that's the conversation that's happening today, which, it's huge progress that since Limits to Growth was written in 1972, we now have a conversation happening with political leaders about growth being a problem, or undifferentiated growth all around the world, as opposed to targeting growth where we need it and constraining growth where it's harmful. But all of that boils down to the answer is we need to shrink the economy because we're breaking the biosphere and share. So if you think shrink and share is a viable pathway out of the polycrisis, I would suggest you need to think a little longer, because the entire economy is designed and leveraged to economic growth. From our municipal budgets, to our national budgets, to our education systems, to our pension plans, to our natural greed for more money, and on and on and on. So this challenge, and this I can say with as much confidence as probably anybody who has a background in finance and has thought deeply about this challenge is way bigger than anything humanity has ever contemplated, with way bigger consequences. And I may be wrong on that, but I challenge anyone to give me an example of something that is a bigger, thornier challenge. And the answer is sitting right in front of our eyes, which is that if we simply use the common sense that we humans are living systems, the only reason we're having this conversation is that our bodies are living systems. The biosphere now, Gaia theory, I wouldn't say it's scientifically accepted that the planet is a living system, but it's nowhere near as radical as when it was first proposed, that is true. Sort of, we quibble over what living means. But the idea that there is this self-organizing, self-regulating, self-governing, magical system of carbon cycles and water cycles and phosphorus cycles that somehow manages to keep going without someone sticking a gas hose in it, is amazing. And so we, humanity, are part of, not apart from, this magical system that I'll generally refer to as the biosphere, just for shorthand. And there's now science that understands how living systems work. And so the point is, either we align ourselves with how living systems work, or we have to defend the argument that we're the only example of a living system that doesn't have to obey those rules. Just like you could design an airplane that doesn't have to obey the rule of gravity. So I don't think that's visionary. I think it's common sense. And yet it's radically different than what we've been programmed to think. And just a quick word on the scientific revolution and mechanism and the reductionist method of, which is essentially what we refer to when we think of the scientific method. It's been incredibly powerful. It's brought us all the progress of the modern age. But it can also be true that two things can be true: that it being true, and that it's woefully inadequate to deal with complexity. And on Friday, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, so I'll just leave it at that. But the economy in any living system, and frankly, anything we manage, from our bodies to our families to our companies to the economy, are complex. And very few leaders have ever even thought about, much less studied, complexity science. And complexity science is actually not the whole story. What we need to understand is the complexity science that is living system science, which is a piece of complexity science. Because there's lots of complex systems that have collapsed. Those are less interesting if we're going to design our entire economy around it. And so Thomas Berry, not related to Wendell Berry, said it really well. He said that we're in trouble because we're in between stories. We're realizing that the old story no longer works, and in this case, the old story of economic growth, but we don't yet have a new story. And I've dedicated my life to that discovery of that new story, at least the second half of my life. I think it's the biggest project that humanity has ever encountered. So yes, theory does matter, because theory determines what we're able to see. And Laura asked me to include this. I forgot, I had to run it back in. I've been running around saying that this shift is bigger than any shift we've experienced since the shift from the medieval era to the modern era, since Copernicus. We're going to need to learn that we're a part of nature. There is no myth. The myth of separation is a myth. And that sometime in the future, historians will refer to this period as the shift into this new era. But we don't even know how to talk about it yet, much less what to call it. But fortunately, we're not putting the people like me talking about it in house arrest. But trust me, I'm also not being invited into the halls of power to explain this, because it's too threatening. I had lunch with the former... The halls of regenerative power. Do those exist? Those are out in the forest. I'll give you an example. I had lunch with the guy that used to run JP Morgan Chase after the merger years ago. I don't even think I was onto the regenerative thing. I had just figured out that exponential growth on a finite planet doesn't work. And here's a guy, successful guy, top of the world, just retired, and a good human being, a gentleman, not at all the banker, the bankster type banker, a Southern gentleman banker. And when I started saying this, I could see his head do this, and I could see his head go down. And he literally said, quote unquote, "John, it's too big. I can't go there." And so our challenge is not to explain this louder and harder. Our challenge is to recognize that our identity as modern Western humans is wrapped up in this mechanistic paradigm. And we need to free ourselves of that, recognize the value of the reductionist method of analysis. But as Ian McGilchrist says, remember that our wisdom lies in the right side of our brain, not the left side of our brain. And we've essentially allowed the left side of our brain to take over the kingdom. And things don't end well when the left side of the brain is running the show. And so it's not a coincidence that I bet you 70%, if not higher, of the people that have shown up into our course are women. There was a little chat over here. It was 5 women were having this conversation. It doesn't mean that men don't understand this and women do. It's not a male-female thing. But men have been trained to be left-brain dominant critters. And we need to put that back into balance and have a balance between masculine and feminine energy if we're to get through this metamorphosis and come out as a butterfly. So, I know we're going to run out of time. Well, let me pause there. Anyone have a reaction against or challenge to that, or anything else to share? Oops.
I'm curious, actually. It's just out of curiosity, because, as you mentioned, we were looking at classical physics, then classical economics, then we went on, in terms of the social sciences, into neoclassical economics, which pretty much are still what rules the world. And somehow, where is the disconnect between quantum physics and the social sciences? Because this goes back we're talking over half a century already of disconnect.
Yeah.
And if I was going to make an analogy, for me, that regeneration is pretty much where if you look at quantum physics and regeneration, they're not very far. And that's on the one hand. And then it's just curiosity in terms, because you cover pretty much this whole, how things got from physics to economics and so on. I'm just curious, where did we get lost between the quantum physics and what's next? And then I had just one question, because, or it's not a question, it's an observation, because we are talking about the way we feel separated is this Western separation. Eastern philosophies have never been separated.
Exactly. Yeah.
And if we go back to, you name it, to the Chinese
I should have made that point. It's not just indigenous cultures. It's a lot of wisdom traditions, in particular Neo-Confucianism. But you're absolutely right.
Yeah, thank you. I was just curious if you.
But on your point on quantum physics, I mean, I don't know the answer. Here's what I suspect. First, how many people in this room understand what quantum physics is?
Not me.
You notice my hand is not up. I mean, there's no one in a position of power in this world we are running who understands quantum physics. I don't think. So that's part of the explanation. The second part, and it's actually not as simple as, oh, we just need to look to quantum physics. Because quantum physics, again, is explaining just the material world. And life is, well, huge orders of magnitude beyond the material world. So we're focusing on this when we need to understand is like beyond this building. Particularly when people say that these patterns and principles apply across the universe. Just, look up universe and look at the numbers. I mean, it's crazy. And then there's another piece, which is only coming into focus recently. And by the way, one of the fun things about this little gig I've decided to take on since I read Limits to Growth is that you just keep learning. And so I've learned from Stu Kaufman, who's one of the great complexity scientists, one of the early Santa Fe Institute scientists. He left the Santa Fe Institute because they're trapped in mathematics. Quantum physics is trapped in the belief that if you can't prove it in math, it isn't true. And the way they get around the uncertainty is with probability theory. And probability theory has done more damage to the financial markets and the rest of us than we have any idea. But the point about the regenerative paradigm is that it's beyond the possibility set, is the language of physicists. It's unimaginable. So therefore, there's no basis upon which to put a probability on it. You know that when the meteorite hit the Yucatan, where's our friend from the Yucatan? Somewhere. Someone's from the Yucatan. Yeah. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Actually, I won't go there. First of all, if you were living before that meteorite, along with the dinosaurs, what probability would you put on the meteorite hitting not just the planet, but the Yucatan Peninsula? Because what wiped out the dinosaurs is not the meteorite, it's the gases that were released from where it hit on the planet. So there's no possible way to put an intelligent probability on that. And even if you did, you would then ignore it, just like we did in the financial crisis, the tail events, because they're so remote they'll never happen. So we're actually dealing with an emergent phenomenon, which is what life is, which is the good news. Because if we create the conditions for life, life manifests emergence into things we can't possibly know in advance. Just like Laura's got 2 beautiful children. Laura has a husband. The day Laura's husband was born and the day Laura was born, there was the potential of her children. The day they were born. In fact, the day they were conceived. In fact, the day their great-great-great-great-grandparents were conceived. The possibility of Laura's children entered the possibility space. Think about that. Emergence is not an engineering problem. And we treat climate change and everything else as if it's an engineering problem that we can solve. And so if we humble ourselves and instead focus on how does life work, what is life, how does life work, I believe that's where our answers are. They're not going to be simple. They're not going to be costless. They're not going to be without lots of trauma and suffering. But turns out there's lots of trauma and suffering in life. That's part of life. Turns out death is part of life. So these knuckleheads who are trying to figure out how to live forever are literally not human beings trying to deny death. And yet they have the power, because of their left brain prowess, to influence the US election in the case of Peter Thiel. Profoundly influence the US election. So we've let our left brain, the emissary in Ian McGilchrist's language, essentially hijack and take over where our wisdom lies. And the regenerative paradigm is not an alternative to sustainability. It's not about agriculture alone. It's not an environmental idea alone, although it is all of those things. Regeneration is literally the process that explains how life works. It's that simple and that complex. And the theory of a regenerative economy is that the economy is a living system and needs to behave the way all other living systems do, which I don't think is some new vision. It's no new invention. It's just seeing what we all see, but through a new set of glasses. Any other comments on the... Does it make sense why I spend so much time on theory? Like, to me, until you process that, you're just fiddling. Like, it's back to ground zero here, and reconstruct the design of an economy that is actually not in conflict with the laws of physics. Our current economy is in conflict with the second law of thermodynamics. How many people in position of power know what the second law of thermodynamics is? Much less why it's relevant to economic policy. I guarantee you, if you found one, you'd be lucky. So it's our ignorance that's at the heart of the matter. I'm going to keep going. How much time do we have? 52 minutes? Is that accurate? Really? We have 20 minutes. Oh, so 20 minutes and then questions. But we're leaving in 50 minutes. Okay. So I talk a lot about, I talk a lot about first principles. The word principles is used to mean a lot of different things. I'm not talking about opinions. I'm not talking about here's how we're going to do stuff. Here's how we're going to behave together. I'm talking about first principles. The best I can do to reduce the science of living systems, how living systems work, from my study of systems ecology, energy flow network science, physics, I haven't tried to study chemistry, cosmology even, into the fewest number of principles that I could do without losing too much by reducing it one further. That's what I mean by first principles. These are not correct. These are not laws of gravity. These are one person's best effort to communicate using the reductionist method. By the way, just to refresh ourselves, you can't split how life works into principles because you're splitting it into parts and it's one whole. But in order to think about it and communicate it, we have to use the reductionist method. That's the way we should use the reductionist method. But that's what I mean by principles. And if we don't get clear on first principles, we will remain lost. One of my teachers, Fritjof Capra, says it nicely. Systems thinking is contextual, which is the opposite of an analytical. Contextual is another word for holistic. Analysis means taking things apart and understanding them as parts, whereas systems thinking means putting them back together. Dwight Eisenhower, one of the great war generals of all time, he was once asked, and a systems thinker, because if you run a war, talk about complexity, the second the first cannon goes off, your plans are out the window. You need to be constantly modifying on the fly. Someone asked him, General Eisenhower, what do you do if you find a problem you can't solve? He said, without hesitating, oh, that's easy. Make the problem bigger. So when someone says, oh, you're trying to boil the ocean, the answer is yes. Because by reducing the problem into its parts, like we saw with carbon vision, we miss the whole point. The carbon cycle is A, piece of a bigger interconnected set of cycles, and B, it's a cycle that involves photosynthesis as well as emissions. And 95% of our focus has been on emissions. We've wasted 25 years. We've wasted 25 years. Photosynthesis is the technology that we should be all in. Every one of us should be doing something to accelerate photosynthesis. I'll get off my little... So, what do I mean by regenerative economics? It's the application of nature's laws and patterns of systemic health, self-organization, self-renewal, and regenerative vitality to the design of our socioeconomic systems. It's that simple and that complex. So I guess if I can leave you with one sort of cheat sheet way to carry this into your work and into your thinking, we've confused what is complicated with what's complex. And the reductionist method is brilliant to solve complicated problems like what's the best design of an iPhone or a bicycle or a rocket ship. It's brilliant for that. In fact, good luck trying to solve that problem using holistic thinking. But this is not complex. There's an answer. There's an optimal size, shape, design. The technology keeps improving, but it's the same thing. Complexity is profoundly different than that. And yet, we treat complexity as if it's merely complicated. And if we're going to deal with complexity, we need to learn to think, the best word is holistically, which is not a great word in the business community because people immediately think you're some California whatever. So use the word complexity, but just know that when we say complexity, we're really talking about holism. And remarkably, there's a man named Jan Smuts, a Boer War general, another general, from South Africa, so a very controversial figure, who wrote a book called Holism, or Holism and Evolution. He coined the term holism. These generals understood holism. He was the founder of the League of Nations, and he was a pen pal of Einstein. Supposedly, Einstein wrote him and said, "My idea of relativity and your idea of holism will determine the future course of human civilization." That's a good testimonial, if it's true. I looked for it, I haven't seen it. So as I said, regenerative economics is not these things. I can't go back. I already said that. It's not sustainability, it's not a left or right philosophy. My hope is that the legitimate conservative ideology and the legitimate liberal ideology will be arguing in the future about how to create a regenerative economy. This is not a left-right thing. This transcends left-right. And it's not just limited to agriculture, although that's obviously where it needs to start, is on the ground, on the land. And if you're I just want to get to work and get stuff done, that's the obvious place to start. The first premise, as I said, the human economy is a living system. That's actually the most important statement of all of these, because everything else flows. And we could have a long conversation about whether that's true or not. I would challenge anyone to make the case that it's not true, but it's not self-evident, I would say. But if that is true, then this premise is true. There is a science of living systems. You can go study it. You can get a degree. It's important to understand that living systems, as I said earlier, don't get reduced to mathematical laws the way physics does. So Bob Ulanowitz, one of my teachers, talks about tendencies toward. So in living systems, things have a tendency toward this or that. So women have a tendency to be smaller than men. That doesn't mean that every woman is smaller than every man. So you can't prove that that's a truth. But that tendency is self-evident. That's the way these patterns and principles operate. So it's harder to work with. It's a dance. It's not a spreadsheet. And the final premise, as I said earlier, if our human economy is to be sustainable, much less thrive and healthy and vibrant and what we want it to be, which is well beyond sustainable, then its design principles will need to match what empirical evidence tells us are the design principles of every other living system that exists on this planet. Because by definition, if it exists, it's living. All the ones that are dead systems are out of the sample space. And they all follow these same patterns and principles. So again, I don't think that's visionary. I think that's common sense. I don't have time to go into these, but I've reduced this to these 8 principles, as I mentioned. But since we're in a finance/investment context, let me just talk about a few of them briefly. Laura mentioned that the unit of analysis of regeneration is place. The unit of analysis of regeneration is best first thought of as place, but it does extend across the entire universe. So the answer is not place-based economies, but the answer is also we need to rethink about our economy in the context of place. And each place is unique, so it's going to manifest differently in each place, both geologically and culturally, but each place is going to look like every other place, just like every snowflake is unique, but every snowflake looks like a snowflake. The 2 I want to focus on are right relationship. There's nothing, if I had to pick one that's the most important, it's this notion of everything is in relationship to everything. And yet we study everything as parts. Gregory Bateson, one of the early great systems thinkers, he'd be standing on a stage like this and he would say, what do you see out there? Tell me, someone say, what do you see? A hand, what else? 5 fingers, what else? Lines in my hands, what else? High five. Wise guy. A what? A person. Every answer you've just given, you've been trained to give for 400 years because of our mechanistic thinking. Everything you just said are parts. What makes the essence of a hand? Hint. We're talking about in right relationship. Hint. What makes a hand, the essence of a hand, a hand? 4 relationships. 4 relationships. See how hard that is to see? We see 5 fingers. We still see the sunrise. We need to learn how to see differently. So why I want to talk about right relationship with finance is that we've designed the system so that finance sits at the top and organizes the economy through optimizing risk-adjusted return on investment in such a way that the economy organizes civilization, otherwise known as labor, and the planet, otherwise known as raw materials, in such a way as to optimize the risk-adjusted return to capital. That's the system design. And I would argue that that is actually completely the wrong relationship. It's literally entirely inside out, because finance is embedded in the economy. It's not bigger than the economy. And the economy is embedded in not just the biosphere, but first in civilization. Civilization is bigger than the economy, but we treat the civilization now as if the economy is the water we swim in. And of course, all of this is embedded in the planet. Now, we would easily observe this if we actually understood and believed in these first principles. Just like if someone designed an airplane that obviously was in violation of the law of gravity, that design would be thrown out before it was even tested. But we don't see the world this way, and so we get frustrated about finance, blah, blah, blah. But the point is, it's profoundly important that we fix the improper relationship between finance and the economy and the rest of civilization. Another example in finance, think about speculation. How many people think that there's too much speculation in the capital markets? No quant traders here. I mean, it's sort of self-evident, but we don't have a way to describe why that's the case. Why is it bad? Who's harming? Some guy's making money, so what's the big deal? Well, think about what happens when you speculate. If Edward thinks that IBM stock's going up and I think it's going down, we trade with each other in a speculative trade, and one of us is going to win and one of us is going to lose. But there's no relationship, much less a right relationship. And so let's say I invest in a fund that's speculating in long-short equities by a bunch of day traders who are just doing this all day long. On the one level, at small scale, it doesn't hurt anything, but it's not small scale. It's massive scale. In fact, it's 90% of the trading volume of the stock markets. And if you don't think, physics, everything's connected to everything, if you don't think that has a knock-on effect on the healthy deployment of capital, you don't understand that everything's connected to everything. And think about a different investment, an investment in a, let's make it an easy answer, a beautiful regenerative organic farm where the investor is in right relationship with the farmer. And let's say because of all kinds of good things and maybe even some subsidies, that generates a 6% return. That 6% in a spreadsheet looks just the same as the hedge fund guy, 6% return. And some investment banker will put a risk parameter on it, which is made up out of thin air, and say, oh, risk adjusted, this is better than this, you should invest in this. It's all made up. The point that we're missing is that the regenerative farm project is in right relationship, and all kinds of good things will flow out of that, regenerative potential, that will never be put in the spreadsheet. And anyone who's invested in a farmer has experienced that, myself included. The second one I want to talk about is balance. It's, again, not hard to convince people that in dynamic balance is kind of a universal principle of how life works, living systems. It's a foundational principle, in this case, in the tradition of yoga. But neoclassical economics, treating the economy as a machine, is all about optimizing the machine. And so there is no reference to resiliency in neoclassical economics. In fact, go ChatGPT and see if you can find, getting ahead of myself, the word resiliency in a neoclassical economics textbook. But it turns out, and this is from, again, Bob Ulanowitz, empirical study of living systems, he discovered that they tend to move into this what he calls window of vitality, where resiliency and efficiency are in balance. And that's where this systemic health is greatest. That's where the window of vitality exists. And if we have more time, we could kind of walk our way through that. But also notice that it's skewed. It's not in the center. It's skewed toward resiliency. And the more volatile things get, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm 99% confident that the more volatility in the world exists, the more it'll skew toward resiliency. So this is missing from our current economic dialogue. Global supply chains, efficient return on capital, mortgages for everybody that are super cheap. That's all about efficiency, plus a little fraud in the case of mortgages. But if we had a theory of regenerative economics, we would be asking, where are we in this window of vitality? And we would be asking that not just in place, but in everything, including the global financial system. When I saw this chart, it blew my mind. It rocked my world, because I lived in a world for 20 years where efficiency was the goal. And in most people, it still is. They talk about efficiency like, oh, that's what these Doge people are doing. Wow, we need more efficiency. Think about the resiliency that's being destroyed by wiping out entire government agencies on no notice, and the trauma you're inflicting in the process. There's completely no awareness that resiliency is a thing, much less how to protect its value in the system. Now I get to my favorite, the finance algorithm. Basically, we've organized our economy in such a way that we mobilize raw materials, otherwise known as natural capital, and human beings, otherwise known as social capital, in such a way as to grow the mountain of financial capital. And this is like the most perplexing piece of the problem, because even if we all become impact investors tomorrow, it doesn't change, it might change the rate of growth of the mountain, but it doesn't change the underlying imbalance between these multiple forms of capital. And one of the principles that I didn't talk about is holistic wealth. We need to understand wealth is not money in the bank. Wealth is this balance between these multiple forms of capital. In fact, many forms of capital beyond these simplistic three. And if balance is a first principle, meaning non-negotiable, if you don't align with this, your system will collapse. You have the reality we're living in today. And it doesn't work just to say inequality is bad. This is a massive, like the metaphor, the dam holding back the water that is the source of life. And so how do we unlock that capital is a massive challenge. Oh, thank you. I thought you left because you didn't like what I was saying. And here you're bringing me water. Speaking of water. Source of life. So I don't have an easy answer to this. I have a lot of ideas on this, but they're too much for today. But as a metaphor, think about what happens with all other forms of life. The word is compost. Death, decay, death, compost. Cycle of life. So as we think about impact investing, I'm not sitting here arguing that everybody should compost all their capital. But I am arguing that the Sovereign Wealth Fund of Norway should be composting massive capital, because they can. And you can tick your way down from there. And if we don't collectively as a system compost capital into natural capital and into human capital, the system will collapse. That's not a vision, that's science, in my opinion. So, are we holding in? Okay. Everybody okay? Let's quickly see. I've been talking about the system level, the abstract system level, literally until now. And of course, we all live in organizations. We live in the system, but we feel like we live in organizations, in families, in communities. And so if these principles are right, everything is fractal, they apply at all scales. They ought to be able to be applied to our human bodies. And one of the exercises I go through in the course is just to sit with the 8 principles and think about how they are in operation or in conflict in your own personal health. Physical, emotional, mental, spiritual, and whatever other categories there are. No one has yet come to me and said, yeah, that doesn't work. Usually there's 1 or 2 of them that obviously we're not in sync with. And, a system is only as powerful as its weakest link. The holistic approach would be to focus on the weakest link, knowing that any one of them, or said differently, all of them need to be at some level of alignment for the system to be healthy. So let's quickly apply this to enterprises. Same definition, only applied to organizations of all kinds. How do we implement this? This is where the conversations that are happening about regenerative finance and regenerative agriculture and regenerative business have fallen down, because we spend most of our time talking about the product or service, which of course we do. That makes total sense. Are you in the renewable energy business or the fossil fuel business? So of course that makes sense. And then we've just spent 20 years trying to come up with metrics to measure all that stuff. But there's all these other layers. And one of my favorites is the business model. Facebook, the internet is probably the most amazing regenerative technology in terms of potential that's been invented in my lifetime. I haven't figured out where AI fits into this yet. It's a long conversation. But the internet has enabled social media, and Facebook has dominated. I'm just picking on Facebook because I like to. Facebook has dominated the social media landscape. How? With a hugely extractive business model. Social media doesn't need to be degenerative, but the business model and the way they operate it has made it hugely degenerative. Now, if they had just a subscription service and all kinds of other, opt-in to my data if I want it to be used or not, and let me even make a better case. What if advertising was at least not tax deductible and in an ideal world prohibited? Facebook would be amazing. And Zuckerberg might have $10 billion instead of $100 billion. And the world would be okay with that. So it's the business model that needs to be regenerative, and we need to think through what does that mean. Secondly, the capital structure. There's been no greater harm done to the free enterprise system than the massive, and Luis will, I think, agree with me on this, the massive, by the way, Luis and I were training program buddies back at JP Morgan back in the day. So it's wonderful to be with him again and share the work he's doing in the world. We just had a wonderful conversation. But the capital structure matters. Think about efficiency and resiliency. How do you get efficiency? More leverage. How do you create resiliency? Less leverage. What has the leveraged buyout industry done? Massive efficiency in terms of return on capital at the cost of resiliency in all kinds of ways to the global economy. And yet no one's talking about Henry Kravis as the evil man that a true understanding. Now, of course, he was ignorant of this. He was just doing what we were told to do. He was smarter than everyone. He was smarter at being a reductionist, mechanistic thinker, and he hit it out of the park. But we don't see that. We see him as success. We don't see him as chopping down the Amazon rainforest. But I see him as chopping down the Amazon rainforest ignorantly. Governance. We could talk forever about governance, but here's what I want to focus on is culture. For any company, the place to start in the regenerative paradigm is the culture. How do you treat your people? It's a human enterprise. How do we create conditions for health so that humans show up and thrive? Because every human has unmanifested potential. And yet we treat humans as cogs in a machine, as particles in a mechanistic system. And we're doing that worse when things get stressed. I'll give you a quick story. There's a colleague of mine who's been funding refugee camps in Africa. And he didn't want to be the ugly American and go over and tell them how to do things. He went over and said, I just want you to do two things. Do me a favor. One, meet each other, gather together, build relationship together. And two, let me give you some tools. They were all farmers of some various degrees. Let me give you some tools, essentially a profit and loss statement. And you guys use the tools and communicate together and build relationship together and figure out how to improve your lives. And before you know it, they figured out that the farmers who were single crop farmers were having much more stress than the farmers who had an integrated business model. And so they all started to integrate their business model. And he sits in Denver. He did nothing other than those two things. And those two things are aligned with the regenerative paradigm. Work in relationship and improve the information flows through the system. Just give people the information and allow their potential to manifest, rather than think we need to set the goals. And philanthropy is terrible at this. Here's your 3-year plan, here's your goals, send me the report when you've met your goals. Chances are the goals are the wrong goals, because the context is always changing. By the way, if you think I'm the only one talking about creating conditions for health and letting go of the outcome, this guy won more national basketball championships than anybody that's ever lived, and that was his philosophy. Phil Jackson, the coach of the winningest NBA team. And I can get you quotes from war generals beyond the ones I just mentioned, where they say the same thing. So this is not some airy-fairy idea. This is a proven approach to leading organizations. And I think I should stop here. Oh, this is a perfect place to stop. Bucky Fuller. Imagine when I discovered that Bucky Fuller was talking about a regenerative universe, long after I had landed on this idea. The affirmations keep coming, and that's why I'm very confident, not that I have it all figured out, but that this is directionally the correct way to go. And by the way, this was the last book he wrote before he died. It was published after his death, I think. And GRUNCH stands for the Gross Universe Cash Heist. Not exactly a poet, old Bucky. And it was his critique of capitalism. And it wasn't very good. He did talk about capital markets, but he, at the beginning and at the end, made this point that we better learn about how the principles of living systems and align our societies with how life works. So, there you have it. Quick ad for our course. I forgot, I was going to come sit down here so that I'm more in community with you all. So. Hi. We do.
Yeah, but I'm not here to challenge you.
No, you're welcome to.
Well, no, you are an elder, and I owe you a lot of respect.
I'm not an elder.
And
you're an elder.
We're all elders somewhere, somehow.
Yeah.
No, it's not necessarily a challenge, but it's really a point of meditation. So when Margaret Mead was asked by one of the students, what was the first sign of civilization? You guys probably read this quote. She said, it was the first repair broken femur. Everybody thought she was going to say, well, the first tool, the first village, the first dam, the first thing. No. She said it was the first repaired broken femur, because it said it was the first sign that we learned to care for each other.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's put that on one corner. Some of the army generals who were negotiating with the Native Americans, the stealing of their land, came in and said, so nobody owns the land. So, well, who do we buy it from? Well, you can't. You can't buy what is not owned. But you are the representative. So can we give you money? Here is what we offer. It's like there is no way to figure out what it is. But then they moved on in the negotiation under the many guns. And eventually he said, okay, well, can you at least clarify for me, how far up do you buy? You know?
Do you buy?
Are you buying the land? So how far up does it go?
And down.
And how far down? And does it include the deer?
Yeah.
What if the deer crosses?
Yeah.
And does it include the water and all of these things? Now, the challenge here is, yes, the concept of civilization, the concept of economies, remember, those are very new terms.
Yeah.
And so the idea that we are, of the old story you mentioned, that's actually a very new story. The old story is the story when we actually understood how everything worked, and that we built all of our living systems, our relationships, according to the natural design of the universe. That, we destroy that to create this current story. We're not, that I couldn't agree with, because what we are trying to do is see if we can still remember who we truly are, so we can actually still expressing ourselves to the optimal capacity that the universe through evolution gave us the capacity to do. And so in this whole concept about regeneration, I have a lot of question marks on a lot of this, and most importantly is because you only quoted white men. You only quoted colonizers. You only quoted the people who defined the stuff as opposed to the people who refused to accept that as the fundamental principle for the way we live. And so here's Chief Seattle, here's the Dalai Lama, here's Margaret Mead, and we didn't hear anything about the immense wisdom that they gave us so that we could today actually have answers to our big questions. What do we do next? Because we are all here to figure out how do we regenerate the planet. And that I want to work with you on, because I know that you guys got an amazing organization, and this is great.
And what I would say to that is two things. One, it's definitely possible that I'm just a patch guy, and I'm trying to patch our way back to something that might work. I fully acknowledge that. I start with the reality that we live in the world we live in today, and there's sort of there's a balance between, one simple answer is reduce population to 1 billion, rely on indigenous wisdom, start over, right? That's not an acceptable strategy for most folks, but that is actually, one could make the case that that's the only viable path. In fact, if you want to get really depressed, go to a biodiversity loss. I went to a biodiversity loss conference where this guy gave a presentation that the Earth can only support 250 million people. Now, I choose not to go. I don't even entertain those conversations. I assume that that's sort of not in the realm of options for obvious reasons. But given that we're 8 billion people, we organize ourselves by institutions. And so I try to think about how to redesign the institutional architecture. And the big missing piece, and I'm going to talk about this a little on Friday, is an institution of the commons. And the institution of the commons, by the way, is orders of magnitude bigger than the private sector or the public sector, or the two of them combined, properly understood. But with respect to who I quote, and I'd love to talk to you about this. In my book, I do quote some indigenous elders, but I always feel uncomfortable because I feel like a fraud. And maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. But I am not the person to talk about indigenous wisdom, and I shy away from it, other than acknowledging it, as I did do today. But that's how I've chosen to address that issue. And I'm working with indigenous people where I live, which happens to be literally the first place of a indigenous massacre in North America happened 2 miles from my house. So there's a fascinating both intellectual and spiritual project, which is reconciling indigenous wisdom and living system science. All I know is that they're cousins. They're not the same, and I'm not qualified to speak to indigenous wisdom. So that's where I'm coming from on it.
Muy buena intercambio. Sigamos con las preguntas de este lado.
Thank you, John, for this wonderful conversation that you're bringing to us today. I have been having a conversation with Stefan over here today about accounting, actually, and general accounting practices. And they are kind of set up under our classical economic structure. Well, they are. And I'm curious, just to get your thoughts on this, we were having a conversation on how we might create a accounting structure for the regenerative business movement, because a lot of times that's where we get our smaller, microeconomic functions, and rubber meeting the road is in our accounting practices and what we're tracking. And so how might we track, and there's organizations maybe trying to solve this, and you see B Corps, and you see different things, and there's probably going to be people talking about B Corps and those types of things. I'm not saying it's bad or good or whatever. Yeah. I think it's a step maybe in the right direction, but it's a huge challenge that how can we possibly create a accounting system that would allow for collaborative means, allow us to see how I can collaboratively work with another business that's close to me, and be able to share in different capital structures, right?
Yeah.
So
We'd
we'd love to get your thoughts on that.
It's a great question. It's a huge question. Accounting at 5 o'clock is usually not the place to go if you want to get invited back. But I'll share a couple of thoughts. One, intuitively, I've resisted the metrics thing like the plague. I have never gotten into the ESG conversation. It just bores me to tears. I'm being candid. I haven't even gotten in the measure our impact conversation in any serious way. I mean, I sort of have followed it. And that's not because it's bad or because it's wrong or because it's not a good thing to do. Of course it's a good thing to do. But I know it's not where the answer lies. And the reason for that is we don't really know what to measure. So point one. Point two, if these first principles are real, there must be a way to measure whether economic exchanges, economic partnerships, transactions, whatever, are kind of broadly in alignment or in conflict. And so, again, go to the example of right relationship. You know, every single stock speculation gets a 0, and every single direct investment in a regenerative company gets a 1. If we could collect the data on every single economic exchange and put a 1 or a 0 on it, we could then see how much of the economy is working in right relationship or not. Now, does anyone really need the answer to that? I don't. I know what the answer is. I don't need to spend 20 years and $1 billion developing data sets and have a bunch of people run around making measurements to know what I already know. I know it because I live in the economy. I've experienced finance. And so for me, wonderful project, but not on my priority list. But having said that, point three, the real scientists in this work do have ideas on how to measure all of these principles. And there's an appendix in my white paper. There'll be a whole section in the book that will come out in the fall on creating measures of regenerative vitality. And we actually have come up with 10. The problem with that is we tried to get funding to develop the project, and no funder understood what we were talking about. But even more importantly, when I pressed the researchers about the data, they made up some mumble jumbo on how we can sort of backward triangulate off of existing data. But you can't, because the data is really granular. And I'm hopeful that some combination of AI, smart people, smart analytical left-brain people, again, a great use of our analytical capabilities, coupled with maybe, citizen science reporting, can begin to give us the data we need to begin to measure this stuff. But I think there's I think we win or lose this challenge based on principles, not based on accounting. Put it that way. We also tend to be pretty good at fudging accounting. And by the way, just sorry to, in the even in the rudimentary, call it ESG accounting, triple bottom line accounting, I remember speaking to I'm blanking on his name. He was running what's the sneaker company? Puma. This is 15 years ago, and they were the first one to publish an environmental P&L. And they did all the analysis, and they factored in da-da-da-da, and they put a price on everything, blah, blah, blah. And turns out this company went from making a profit to losing a lot of money. No one cared. No one even asked a question at the next quarterly earnings. And he said it was useful to do because it gave me a language to talk to my team with. So again, the usefulness may be simply as a communication tool, not as a way to steer the economy. But that's a true story, and I don't think the answer has probably changed much since, which is why, in many ways, John Elkington kind of withdrew the triple bottom line. He invented it, and then he had a great term for it. I can't remember, but he effectively took it out of circulation, said it ain't working. So.
Okay, so thank you so much for the presentation. For me, it was really interesting and inspiring. Yeah? I did like so much the challenge or the invitation that after this meeting, we will have the chance to do something to change what we are living. Thank you for your, I don't feel it's a challenge, but I think it's an invitation to continue building up that speech of the change of paradigm, because we have lots of people that is not here, and we need to influence more powerful people that are absent here. And to answer, it's not an answer, but an invitation, I would say that we need to sign a commitment. We are here, we need to sign a commitment only in terms of keeping our relations, because we have, in our previous history, you have, many of us as well, many of others that are not here, we have a previous history of understanding and trying to build this up. We can sign a commitment to keep in touch, as the people in Sudan, I don't know exactly where was the camp, to get to know each other better and keep on having relations. And that is going to build up the advance of us in the future.
Yeah,
Thank
you for saying that. I couldn't agree more. Well, go ahead, Laura.
No, go ahead, please.
So that is, there was a great Nobel chemist, Prigogine, and he has this now very used quote, another white guy, when systems are, he's the inventor of chaos theory. So when systems are far from equilibrium, small islands of coherence can shift the entire system. So what we are creating here today, and many circles, pebble, are islands of coherence. And I don't know, it'd be interesting to hear, the indigenous tribe I'm working with in New England is building an intertribal council, which feels to me like an island of coherence. We have we don't just run courses. We built a community of over 2,000 people. It's called With Life. And our vision, this is a vision, not common sense, our vision is that it will be the Silicon Valley of the regenerative paradigm. And so if you're an entrepreneur, if you're an investor, if you're an academic, if you need to go to a class, if you need to go to a cultivator, not incubator, we call it a cultivator, if you just want to meet people, if you want to meet your future spouse. We have one romantic relationship to our credit that I know of. And there's going to be thousands of these. There already are thousands of these. And what the system scientists say is that once you have these islands of coherence, the next thing is to connect them to each other. So thank you for bringing that up. Let's not all just walk away and go, oh, that was interesting, and back to our day job.
No, we're not. No, I just wanted to take advantage of those questions and comments and challenges, because John wasn't here in the morning, and so he wasn't hearing your talk. And it's an invitation for re-identification, because we are all indigenous of this planet. So, I feel your pain. I have within me both the indigenous and the colonizer in the metaphorical sense and in the inheritance sense. And I do believe I find my reconciliation in your hope of making us all indigenous to Earth. And I think the re-identification process is super healing and liberating, because you're not a fraud. But you might be able to add Donella Meadows there. That I think in the metrics question, so I think there was, back in 2018, the day I met Reggie, we were in San Francisco in a gathering of impact investors that were for the first time wondering about regeneration. Reggie spoke in a church, in a cathedral. That was really weird. I mean, cool, surreal. But we did a metrics workshop and we did a metrics conversation. And so there's a camp of people that go to the principles, there's a camp of people that go to the metrics, and there's a camp of people that go to the outcomes. And I really like the outcomes.
You like the what?
The outcomes. I'm in the camp outcomes. Like Melina said, beauty. Beauty is a sign of regeneration. You know, that the right relationship is a sign of regeneration. So there's plenty of camps. The conversation is deep. And there's a story to close. So one of the metrics that we were talking about in that workshop was minimum of smiles per hour. And so there was actually an experiment, I think it was Australia. There was a lot of youth suicide in a town, and they just experimented with a sign that said minimum 10 smiles per hour or minimum 30 smiles per hour, whatever. They put it up in the streets, and the suicide rate dropped. It was amazing. So like in a very reductionistic metric was a regenerative outcome. And so I think we have profound wounds to heal, and I think there's a ton of hope in this room. Thank you, John.
Yeah, although I would say that was an intuitive metric that a reductionist method would never have suggested would work. No. You got to come back Friday. You're coming back anyway.
Muchísimas gracias a todos, Pau.
Bueno, antes de Muchas gracias, John. It was great having you here, and we are very grateful having you here tomorrow and on Friday. We are really, really lucky to having you here.
Pregunta visual. ¿Me oyen? Una encuesta visual. ¿Quién sintió que su inversión de tiempo y talento hoy, who felt your investment today was worth it?
El QR. Pero queremos que eso se vea reflejado en ese QR, así que por favor, los que quieran su certificado, para que nos ayuden a llenarlo.
¿Y quién me creyó lo del doctorado al principio?
Yo quiero hacer avisos parroquiales para mañana, pero antes de eso agradecer infinitamente a todos ustedes, porque la energía que hemos sentido hoy acá ha sido increíble. Una actitud de apertura, de positivismo, de querer aprender, de querer llevar este mensaje, de querer conectar. Entonces, de verdad, gracias, porque el evento no es quien los organizan, el evento es quienes participan y con la actitud que participan. Entonces, gracias y un aplauso para todos ustedes. Vamos a tomar una foto de todo el grupo, por favor, si nos paramos en la tarima. Sí, claro. Sí, por favor, ¿qué crees?
Todos los personajes de la historia. Toño, súbete. Emi, thank you. Thank you, Mustard Seed Trust. Come on. Todos. Luis Miguel, corre Luis Miguel. Muy aclamado en México, Luis Miguel. Sí. Tú también subes. Etienne, Adri, no se hagan. María, Rubén, Pablo. Todos al stage. Jesús, no te quedes atrás. Andrea.
Ahorita te lo consigo.
Vengan,
Vamos a la foto, los invito. Vamos a tomarnos
todos a
una
la
foto.
Estefan, Lady, gracias Lady por traernos a John.
¿Qué?
Entonces
acá abajo.
Todos.
Listo. Acá abajo, segunda fila. Vamos acá.
Adam, Reggie,
Lau.
María Elvira, todos. Sí. Los chicos de manto. ¿Va a colapsar el stage? No. Que no colapse. Bueno, vénganse unos acá. ¿Y quién la toma? El fotógrafo. Okay. Ana Caro, vente, la toma el fotógrafo. Aquí yo me hago con cuidado. Sí. Que si se ponen al frente del stage, al frente del stage, al frente del stage. Sí. Vengan, vengan. No alcanzo a ver con la luz, pero los que están platicando arriba de la escalera, vénganse. Todos son bienvenidos a la foto. Sí. Acá al frente, todos. 5, 4, 3. Vamos a decir micelio, ¿ok? 5, 4, 3, 2. Falta un fotógrafo. Ay.
Ok. Bueno, todos por favor mirando a esta cámara. ¿Listo? Cuando cuente 3 van a ser ojitos bien abiertos. ¿Listo? No exagerado, pero ojos abiertos, ¿vale? Si no, lo mismo que hicimos afuera, si no ven el lente, yo no los veo. Hay alguien que está detrás de una, por ejemplo tú, exacto, hazte un poquito más a la derecha, por favor. Las personas que están a mi lado izquierdo, no las voy a ver probablemente. No importa, si quieren algunos, para que no se agachen, pueden coger sillas de estas. ¿Sí? Se va a ver un poquito raro. Se va a ver un poquito raro. Mira.
Juan Sebastián,
Mira.
vente a la foto. Hernán, vente a la foto. Tomás, vente a la foto. Corre, Tomás. Tomás, ¿encontraste tu mochila? Oh, damn. Ahorita sale. Ahorita sale. Hay tantas mochilas negras en todos lados.
Sí, pero ya la hemos buscado por todas partes. Kevin, falta.
Kevin. Bravo, bravo. Al violo, exacto. La palabra de la mañana. Al violo. No, pero ella además tiene el apellido.
Sí, sí. Siempre me pasa.
La verdad, sí. O sea, sí.